the top 10. Top 10. This is the top 10. Top 10. This is the top 10.
Hello YouTubers and welcome to Big Buddha is Watching. I'm Big Buddha and today I'm going to be doing my top 10 movies from the last decade. This was really just inspired by the fact that I was reading an article recently. Apparently it's the 10-year anniversary of being able to download movies on iTunes. You know, that momentous occasion that we all celebrate. I don't think I don't really use iTunes, and I've certainly never downloaded a movie on iTunes. But to commemorate this, there was a brief article in which they asked a few people to name the top 10 movies from the last decade. They asked people like Simon Pegg and Andy Serkis, and they came up with their list, and you know, I just thought I'd do my list as well, because I'm startlingly unoriginal, as you know. So, just before I start, when I say the last decade, before anybody gets really pernickety and pedantic about this and says, well, actually, this film came out in April 2008. Okay, I'm just going from January 2008 onwards, okay? For simplicity's sake, I'm not getting that specific with the data that this was recorded. The simple rule to this, if it came out 2008 or later, it goes on the list. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go. So, my 10th favourite film of the last decade is... Come on. Yeah. The Wolf of Wall Street. Now, this is an interesting one. I've talked before about how Tarantino has popularised the retiring after 60 ethos as a director. He seems to think that a director loses his punch as he ages, as he gets into his 60s and 70s. And he insists that he's going to retire gracefully when he's 60 rather than carry on directing inferior films into old age. And I think it's interesting since he's put this theory about that a lot of directors, at least the best directors, Spielberg and who have you, have been really pushing themselves, trying to prove him wrong, because those guys are in their 70s now. And if you're going to make a case that a director can still pull their best work out of the bag, then I think that The Wolf of Wall Street, Martin Scorsese's movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, it would be a good place to start. The Wolf of Wall Street is really, I feel, Scorsese's attempt to show that he's still got it as a director. This really feels like, at least artistically, it's a companion piece to his best works, of which I would put Goodfellas and Casino into the same category. I mean, Goodfellas and Casino are kind of companion pieces to each other, stylistically very similar and covering the same subject matter as well. The Wolf of Wall Street is slightly different subject matter, whereas those films dealt with the mafia. This deals with a different sort of criminal, the 80s yuppie. In particular, Jordan Belfort, who was a New York stockbroker who basically led a very hedonistic lifestyle from the late 80s right through to his incarceration in about 2004 for insider trading. And the film charts not only his rise to success, but also his amazingly hedonistic lifestyle. It's one of those films where you wonder how much it is exaggerated from real life. Like, say, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. When you watch that film, you wonder, could a person really take this many drugs over such a short period of time and survive? And then you read up on Hunter S. Thompson and you find out, yeah, it might just have been possible, at least by his own admission and by his own claims. And indeed, you watch The Wolf of Wall Street in the same light, you wonder, could a guy really have led this lifestyle over the length of period that he did and survived? By all accounts, this film isn't totally exaggerated. It's maybe 90%, 95% accurate. It's a really, really fun movie. It's Scorsese doing a black comedy. It's a really, really funny film. Possibly the funniest film that Scorsese's done since The King of Comedy, which is one of my favourite films, definitely. And so seeing Scorsese return to black comedy was a real treat. And the film's got a very compelling central performance, well, a series of central performances. At the centre of it all, you have Leonardo DiCaprio, who really anchors the film with his portrayal of Belfort in a kind of warts and all portrayal. He's not afraid to come across as a major asshole in the film. But the film also has a great supporting cast. Everyone from Margot Robbie to Jonah Hill to Joanna Lumley, even in the cast. The big criticism of the film is that at 3 hours, people wonder, well, why do you want to spend so much time in the company of people who are so horrible? And I don't get this claim at all. There's plenty of films made in which the protagonists are morally dubious, and it's whether those protagonists stray from the moral course that they've set in their world or not that really defines whether you engage with the character's plight or not. Although Belfort is a truly horrible person, you fully go along with his story. You want to see his rags to riches tale take place. The film does adhere to the structure of a rags to riches tale of an awful person. You do see the downfall. If it just been he became a success and stayed as success, yes, he goes to prison towards the end of the film. I mean, you could argue that that was only a minor downfall, but I mean, nobody levelled these claims at the Goodfellas or Casino. As horrible as Belfort was and the lives that he destroyed, he never flat out murdered anyone, so I don't really get the argument that spending 2 hours with the likes of Henry Hill and Goodfellas is any better than spending 3 hours in the company of Jordan Belfort. But hey, when a movie's this fun and exuberant and full of energy and funny, you can't deny that it's just a good time when you watch the film. So number 10, The Wolf of Wall Street. Number 9 is...
Well. Looks like Minnie's haberdashery is about to get cozy for the next few days.
Yes, it does. One of them fellas is not what he says he is. Now we're talking!
The Hateful Eight. So I've mentioned Tarantino already. As you know, he's one of my favourite directors, somebody I'll rave about at any available opportunity. To be fair, I knew there was going to be a Tarantino movie on this list. Of the 3 films he has directed in the past 10 years, I don't know if I'd have put Inglourious Basterds on the list, but this one was really a toss-up between this and Django Unchained. I could have happily put either film on the list. Big Western fan. Arguably, Inglourious Basterds is a spaghetti Western as well. It just happens to be set in World War II. But stylistically, that film's a spaghetti Western. But if Django Unchained was Tarantino having a go at a Western, The Hateful Eight is him mastering the genre, if you ask me. This sounds very weird, but I'll come back to this later on in the list. But I really like seeing snowy forest scenes in films. I think there's something about the combination of snow and forest in a film. I think aesthetically that's the sort of best look you can achieve in a film, and I always like seeing it in films. So it was in War for the Planet of the Apes recently that had a similar aesthetic, because although the scene looks cozy, at the same time it's also a hostile environment. You get that great conflict of beauty and tragedy there. The Hateful Eight is another 3-hour epic, and it's funny to call it an epic because this film could almost be a stage play. Indeed, Tarantino has expressed an interest in putting it on the stage because the majority of it just take place in one single location, a snowbound cabin in the woods, Minnie's haberdashery. And it's a very simple plot to get 8 bad men holed up together, developing cabin fever in the snow, give them all guns and see which one survives to the end. It's Tarantino firing on all cylinders. All his hallmarks are there, working the best they've ever worked. The dialogue is the best that you've ever heard in a Tarantino movie. The performances, especially Samuel L. Jackson, are the best. The cinematography looks great. The artistic flourishes are all there. The nods to other films. The bizarre Tarantino moments are there. I didn't quite know how to take the mouth rape scene when I first saw it, but hey, that's Tarantino. He really swings from the fences in his storytelling. It's not an entirely perfect movie. It's not overlong. I just think it falters really in the last act. The first 2 hours of this movie are an absolute masterpiece. He lost his way a little in the last hour. The flashback scene almost didn't need to be a flashback scene. It could have gone very easily, I felt, at the start of the film, been the prologue to the film, because the revelations don't really add up to much. And I'm sad to say that the final act of the film, the final chapter of the film, feels a little muddled to me. It feels like he didn't really know how to wrap this film up, so it goes all over the place. The characters that I didn't like are the ones that end up surviving to the end, and I ended up wondering, were we rooting for these guys to be the last survivors? Because I certainly wasn't. I actually wanted Daisy Donoghue to be the surviving character, the one who overcame it all, and it seemed to be going that way. And then I wasn't quite sure whether I was meant to be pleased that, spoilers, that character met her demise in the end. That's a bit of a shame. I think if he'd have managed to maintain the quality of the first 2 acts in the third act, I think this would have been Tarantino's masterpiece and a lot higher up on the list, to be honest. But there you go. Number 9, not number 8, is The Hateful Eight. The actual number 8 is... Avengers Assemble, and I absolutely love this film. I'm a big fan of the MCU. They seem to be really doing the impossible at the moment, which is creating mainstream blockbuster fare that's successful, but is also not necessarily artistically worthy, just not shit. You don't know what a trick that is to pull off these days when there's so many bad blockbusters out there. How they manage to create film after film after film, which are all, at worst, okay to good, and at best absolutely amazing. This one is the one that's blown me away the most. I haven't seen Infinity War yet. I'll hold my hands up to that. I know some people would put other films in the MCU as probably being the best over this. I know there were some out there that may be technically better. The Winter Soldier and Civil War are 2 that spring to mind, but for me this is the one where it really gelled, where it really coalesced and came together. Having 5 films leading up to this, Iron Man, The Incredible Hulk with Ed Norton, Iron Man 2, Thor, and Captain America the First Avenger, which were all enjoyable but hardly groundbreaking, I thought. This one just exceeded my expectations. I was hopeful for it when I heard that Joss Whedon was doing it, because I was always been a big Joss Whedon fan ever since from Buffy the Vampire Slayer onwards. It's always perplexed me that he hasn't made more movies, but I think Avengers Assemble might be his finest hour. It's my favourite superhero movie. Oh, well, it kind of jostles for the best place in my mind. It's either this or Batman Begins for me, but yeah, it's a film I absolutely love, and it's definitely the most fun I've had in a cinema over the past decade. So that's at number 8. Number 7 is...
Are you ready? Yes. Are you nervous? Is the right answer!
Slumdog Millionaire. Now, who'd have thought that a movie all about who wants to be a millionaire, the slightly naff game show, would be so high on this list? Well, would be not only a good movie, but a great movie, if you ask me. This was such an unusual premise. I remember looking up Danny Boyle and seeing what he was doing next and seeing this movie, Slumdog Millionaire, she had in development, and thinking, oh, that sounds bizarre. I thought, there you go, he's making a small little art house movie that will probably come and go. And when I saw the film, it absolutely blew me away. Just to give it some background, so I think it's Celador who produced Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. The show was so successful and been sold all around the world that they wanted to do a movie of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and they contacted Danny Boyle about doing it. He initially didn't have any interest in doing it. It was the script that Simon Beaufoy wrote that really intrigued him and made him want to make the film, because it was such a good script and it was such an original script. India hadn't really been portrayed to mainstream British and American audiences on the big screen for a long time, so there was something unique that Boyle could do with the script. And also he realised that having the structure of a character on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, it practically wrote or told the story itself, because the structure of the film is you have flash forwards to Dev Patel, who's appearing on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and then you see his flashback to his childhood when he's growing up in the slums, and basically every question he answers correctly, and you see why he knows the answer, which tells a little bit of the story throughout. So it's an ingenious structure for a film. I'm a big fan of the dark fairy tale movie, and this is a dark fairy tale movie. It's a fairy tale movie. It's about somebody who achieves his dreams and comes good in the end, but it really holds no punches. It really doesn't sugarcoat the real world and what goes on, especially in India, in the slums, and the awful conditions that these young children, I mean, infants, are growing up in. So it's really admirable for that, and I think the film just works really well throughout. If there's one thing I don't personally like about it, is the Bollywood dance number at the end. I thought that just went a little bit too film for me, if you like, but I know a lot of people disagree with that. And also Boyle has stated the reason he put it in is because an Indian audience would be expecting that at the end of the film, because that's just how you end Indian movies. So okay, if it had to be in there for audience expectation reasons in the culture that the film is set in, then okay, I'll forgive it that. But that was just my personal little thing. But yeah, film I really enjoy, Slumdog Millionaire. Number 6 is a Bond movie.
Let the sky fall when it crumbles. We will stand tall and face it all together at Skyfall. Skyfall is where we start.
I think Skyfall is the best Bond movie of all time. Everything just got elevated with this film. It was the 50th anniversary movie. It came out in 2012, Dr. No having come out in 1962. And they did something that it amazes me it took them 50 years to get around to doing, which is actually hiring a good quality director to make a Bond movie and not some hack who will just go through the motions. They hired Sam Mendes of American Beauty and Road to Perdition fame. And he's British, of course. But I think it also helped that Quantum of Solace wasn't a great movie, the one preceding this one. But Casino Royale was Daniel Craig's first film. The reason for that was, I think it was written during the writer's strike, so they really rushed into it with an incomplete script and were writing a lot of it on the fly. They tried to paper over the cracks that they basically didn't have a story to tell, with just throwing in too many action scenes. Unfortunately, when you don't have a good story to hang action scenes on, then the action just becomes dull, it just becomes white noise. So they knew that going into this one, which had a 4-year development period, they knew that they really needed a strong story to tell. And I think this is the Bond movie where we get the closest to the Bond character of any of the movies. It really delves into the psychology biography of Bond, who the person is, and we also get the closest we're ever going to get to Bond's backstory, really, in this one. The final act of the film, the showdown, takes place in Bond's childhood home, the Skyfall of the title, which was a nice rug pull. I always assumed going into it that, I mean, Skyfall, you think it's going to be the name of a satellite that's hovering over Earth that the villain has commandeered and is using to hold the world to ransom, but it's not. The fact that it was his childhood home really worked well. But yeah, I think it's a great film. Everything about it works. The action is great and really rooted in the narrative of the film. It explores the Bond character in far more depth than any of the other movies, which was refreshing to see, actually. I think it's something that the audience wanted to see. We've been watching him for 50 years now on the big screen, and we still don't really know who this guy is. So I like that they finally allowed us to peel back the layers a bit and see a bit more of this character. And I like how the film explores the themes of Bond. It uses all the cliches that you need to have in a Bond movie, pulls the rug out from under your feet and subverts expectation, and just does everything really well. It does everything that's comparable with Bond in the best of the series. The villain, I think, played by Javier Bardem, is comparable to Goldfinger. He's everything you want in a Bond villain. He's sinister, he's kind of campy, he's scary, he's got dark secrets, he's physically disfigured, which is another cliche. Yeah, I think it's a fine movie, Skyfall, and to be honest, I'd be very surprised if the series ever equals the quality of that film again. So that was number 6. Number 5 is...
For 2 weeks? In Bruges? In a room like this? With you? No way. Been to the top of the tower? Guidebook says it's a must-see.
Well, you ain't going up there.
Why?
It's all windy stairs. I'm not being funny.
What exactly are you trying to say?
They're a bunch of elephants.
In Bruges. In Bruges. If you saw my top 10 favourite movies of all time, or indeed many other videos, you'll know that With Nail and I is one of my favourite films. You'll know that also, as I've said, even in this video, that Tarantino is one of my favourite directors. What I love about In Bruges is it's kind of With Nail and I if it was directed by Tarantino or written by Tarantino, but set in Europe and with 2 Irish hitmen. This film was a real surprise. A friend of mine lent it to me and I watched it really not knowing much about it. I was aware of the film. All I really knew was the title and that it had Colin Farrell in, which was kind of enough to put me off in the first place. I didn't even know what the critical consensus on the film was going in, so it was a real surprise to me, a refreshing treat when I watched the film, because it was funny, but funny in a way that I like. The humour in it is derived from real life and it feels authentic. You're laughing because you recognise the way that real people act. It's not comedians mugging for laughs in the film. The humour is very dark and X-rated and politically incorrect, which is also something that I find refreshing and laugh at a lot. It's a very, very well-written film and a very well-structured film. And it's a film that doesn't reveal itself. I mean, going into it, I didn't even realise that the 2 central characters are hitmen, and it takes a good 10 or 15 minutes for that revelation to come along. And so the story slowly reveals itself through flashbacks and conversations, and you slowly but surely come to realise what these 2 characters are doing, basically stranded in this very remote, quiet but idyllic looking city in Belgium. Fine performances throughout. Easily Colin Farrell's best performance. Brendan Gleeson is I mean, I can find him a little smug, actually, Brendan Gleeson. He's one of these actors that he is good and talented, but he always comes across as knowing how good he is, which I find a little off-putting. But, I mean, yeah, he's fine. And Ray Fiennes, actually, one of my favourite actors. He's absolutely hysterically funny in this film. I don't know what it is, but posh actors make really, really good East End villains, I think, because they give them something that I don't think think many working class actors give the East End characterizations. They make them sinister, they make them scary, and Ray Fiennes is scary in this film. He's playing against type because he's playing quite a stupid person. I mean, he meets his downfall in the end because of his own stupidity. I love Ray Fiennes in this film. The only big regret I have in this film is if you watch the deleted scenes, there was an excise flashback in which Matt Smith from Doctor Who played the young Ray Fiennes. Kind of perfect casting, if you ask me. I think it's a shame that that didn't make it into the film. Number 5, In Bruges. Number 4 is... Blade Runner 2049. So, of course, the original's in my top 10 movies of all time list. So the sequel, I'm going to stick it in my favourite movies of the last decade for good measure. I mean, I've only seen it twice now, but I'm thinking there is a possibility it could make it into my top 10 favourite movies of all time list at some point. I'm slowly coming around to the opinion that it is a superior work to the original. It's certainly more epic in scope. I'm very, very grateful that Ridley Scott didn't direct this. I think Ridley Scott is an overrated hack. Although he did direct Blade Runner, he hasn't really done much of artistic worth since that movie. And I think if he had directed this, he'd have made it too glossy. I really appreciate Denis Villeneuve sticking to his guns and making something that felt deliberately paced like a movie from the 70s. Tonally, it feels actually like it owes more of a debt to a film like Chinatown rather than the original Blade Runner. I won't bang on about the original because it's its own thing. It's a masterpiece in its own right, Blade Runner 2049. It looks like the original film, but then it has its own look. And that's only right, being set 30 years after the original. Of course, the world would have developed and changed in that time. The ecosystems have collapsed, and so you get these extra layers where for the first time we venture outside the city and we see the devastated landscape of outside of the futuristic Los Angeles of the film. That sets it apart from the original. The look, the cinematography of Roger Deakins is absolutely stunning and beautiful. It doesn't quite have the comic book aesthetic of the first film, but I think if it had tried to copy the look of the original, or at least the feel of the look of the original, it would have fallen flat, as many films have over the years. So I like that it feels like its own beast. The story's compelling. It takes the themes of the first film and expands on them. Hell, I'm just going to go over really what I said in my initial reactions video when I first saw the film. If you want to know my thoughts on the film, just watch that. It's one of the ones I did in the car straight after seeing the film, and it's all in there. Blade Runner 2049. Fantastic. Number 3 is... Revenant. Going back to what I was talking about with The Hateful Eight, big fan of films set in snowy forests. And this is a film set in a snowy forest. So it looks great, this film. As you head towards middle age, I think that's the time that blokes really start getting into westerns. I don't know what it is, but it's something about the lone frontiersman, the man out there battling against the world, battling against the elements. A man's got to do what a man's got to do. A man has to man up in this environment. If somebody stands in your way, one of you's going down. They're all about standing your ground, westerns. And I know, strictly speaking, this isn't a western. I believe it's set in the 1820s or the 1830s. It's more a northern than a western. It's a very snowbound film. Another Leonardo DiCaprio film, Leonardo DiCaprio performance. So the basic story, if you don't know, is Leonardo DiCaprio, he's a fur trapper, and one day he gets attacked by a bear in the woods. Now, he manages to kill the bear, but it's basically left him badly injured. injured and almost dead. He has a Native American son. Tom Hardy is charged with staying behind with him whilst the rest of the crew move on, because if they stay there's a chance of them being attacked by the natives. They all leave him with Tom Hardy. Tom Hardy then decides that he's better off just putting him out of his misery, but his Native American adopted son disagrees. Tom Hardy then ends up killing the son and leaving Glass, the Leonardo DiCaprio character, for dead. But he survives, and the rest of the film is basically a revenge story where Glass has to essentially crawl like 100 miles through some of the harshest terrain, through icy rivers and snowback mountains, trying to figure out a way to patch his body back together and survive the elements and get back. And then, of course, he gets back to his camp. Then the film becomes a basic revenge story. It's apparently a true story. It's an amazing true story. The film was directed by Alejandro G. Inarritu, who's a filmmaker I've got a lot of time for. I've never not been impressed with his movies. In fact, I really want to revisit them and possibly talk about them on this channel at some point, because he hasn't done a lot of films, but the ones he has have really changed with me. Amores Perras, 21 Grams, Babel, a fine trilogy of work there. And the films he's done in recent years, I'm not going to mention the other one, and you'll see why in a minute, but I've been really impressed with his work of late as well. The Revenant's an amazing piece of work. I mean, it was a real hardship. Some of the stuff you see DiCaprio doing in the film, he's not in some safe studio somewhere. He really is naked in the snow in some of these scenes, and so what he manages to get the actors to do in this film is just staggering. And it's also a staggeringly beautiful film, all the more amazing when you find out that the film was predominantly shot in natural light. They didn't just shoot anything and thought, okay, we can tart that up with the digital processing. They said, no, we're going to wait until the light's right. Sometimes the light would only be right for an hour and a half a day. So it was quite a staggering artistic achievement, I think. It does rely slightly heavily on the single take, which isn't really a single take, which I always think is kind of a weird cheat thing, this. But it makes the film look novel, because a lot of the scenes appear to take place as single takes, even though there are some hidden cuts that you can totally see if you're savvy enough. I'm kind of torn on this single take with hidden edits thing in, because I often think that the reason for doing a single take is, anyone who's ever tried to film anything will know that single takes unedited are really hard to achieve, because if a mistake happens or an actor fluffs his lines, then the whole scene's got to be remounted. It can't just be papered over with editing. And also, like, if a scene doesn't flow well, then it's impressive when you see a single take on film. But a single take with a hidden edit, I always think, well, what's the point of that? Because it's almost saying, hey, look how well we shot this film without any edits, even though we are totally using edits. But although they're fake, the single edits do lend this film a unique look. It sort of differentiates it apart from a lot of other westerns or historical-based films, action-based dramas, and I really enjoy the film, so I'll forgive it that. So that's at number 3. Number 2 is...
How did we end up here? This place is horrible. Smells like balls. We had it all. You were a movie star, remember?
Who is this guy? He used to be Birdman.
I like that poster.
You wrote this adaptation?
I did, yeah.
And you're directing and starring in your adaptation. That's ambitious.
Alejandro G. Inarritu's other film of the past decade, Birdman, or to give it its full title, Birdman or the Unexpected Virtue of Ignorance. I mean, I don't know why they bothered putting that on, because A, I can never ever remember that bit. It doesn't trip off the tongue like Doctor Strangelove or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. And B, I'm still not sure what the Unexpected the virtue of ignorance is. I'm sure Inaritu knows. But yeah, this film is fantastic. It blew me away. It's a comedy drama. It's very relatable to anybody who's grown up watching blockbuster movies. The film concerns Michael Keaton. In the film, he plays a character who was a big superhero star back in the late 80s and early 90s, I guess, much like Keaton himself. With the character Birdman, he apparently made a trilogy of superhero movies about the Birdman character. Now his career's on the wane a little, and he decides that he wants some artistic merit, so he decides to put on a Broadway production of one of his favourite short stories as a play. I forget who the writer is, but I know it's a real writer. Oh, Raymond Carver. The film basically centres around the frustrations that he has putting the play on, and deals with all the themes of what it means to seek artistic merit, and is it a noble thing to pursue, or is it ultimately frivolous? Like The Revenant, this film uses lots of single takes with hidden edits in. In fact, the whole film in effect is presented as a single take, even though it is a series of edits, but where the edits are hidden. And I guess the reasoning behind doing that is to create a similar sort of artifice as the play. Many of the scenes do play out in single takes. Admittedly, there's far less edits in this film than there is in most other movies, so I will give it that. And I think as a gimmick, it scores over The Revenant. In The Revenant, I got the impression that Inaritu has got into a habit of shooting this way, so he carried it over into The Revenant, but there was really very little reason for the gimmick to be used in that film. Here there is actually a reason to use it, because when you're dealing with a film about theatre, it was an imaginative gimmick to recreate the feeling of theatre, the tension that actors feel when they have to deliver a continuous performance and they're not going to be saved by the magic of editing. It's a great film. It's frenetically paced, it's original, it looks original, it's full of great performances. I mean, Michael Keaton's one of my favourite actors, but I think this will go down as his crowning glory, this film. He's really, really good in this film, as are the rest of the cast. Emma Stone. Edward Norton's also great. I think after Fight Club, this is possibly his second greatest performance, second greatest movie. He plays a real asshole actor in the film, but a great actor. The film's funny. It has some fun fantasy sequences in it. The Birdman character actually appears as a character himself in the film, and that's a lot of fun. The only gripe I really have with it is that they do the fake out ending once too often, I feel. Obviously there's a point where the film actually does end, but when it did end, I felt that had they ended it a scene earlier, I'd have been just as happy, and it might have had more of an impact really had it ended a scene earlier. I think the final scene doesn't quite make much sense, although the final shots, the final thing that happens in the film was a good way to go out, but the final scene is a little confusing, and I felt that there were a couple of points where the film could have ended earlier in the story. It kind of overstays its welcome, but that is literally my only gripe with the film. I think this is an absolutely fantastic film, and if you haven't seen it, check it out, and that's why it's the second best film I've seen in the past decade, and hands down the best film I've seen in the past 10 years is
800 million people living in the ruin of the old world. Only one thing fighting for order in the chaos. The men and women of the Hall of Justice.
You know how often we get a judge up in peace trees?
Well, you got one now.
Dredd, not Judge Dredd from 1995 with Sylvester Stallone. The definitive Dredd movie, which although probably strays more actually from the source material than the Sylvester Stallone movie in a funny sort of way. It actually gets it right in that a lot of people unfortunately think that to do any sort of adaptation successfully, you have to adhere to the source material as closely as possible, and it's totally not true actually. You can deviate from the source material in the details as long as you retain the sense of what the source material was. 2000 AD, it was essentially a comic that came along in the late 70s and in Britain in the era of punk rock, and it is to comics what the Sex Pistols were to music. It's an anarchic, dirty Harry in the future story, and that's essentially what the film is, and so much more. Although it's science fiction, it's almost believable. You almost believe that we could be heading this way. It takes the iconography of the Judge Dredd character but makes it feel realistic. You could buy that as a police uniform in the future. You could buy that they'd wear those silly helmets, because when you're dealing with a society where violence is running this rampant, of course the police, or judges as they're known in this society, are going to wear those helmets. You can totally believe that in a world where the population is growing at the extent it is, that the tower blocks, the towns in the sky that are depicted in this film would exist and violence would run rife through these buildings. One of the things I like about it is when I was a kid, I actually remember thinking I want to see a film that's a cross between Blade Runner and Die Hard. I want to see a film that essentially takes the story of Die Hard but sets it in the future. And when Dredd came along, I was delighted because that's it. It's Die Hard in the future, but really, really well written. Alex Garland, who wrote and by all accounts directed this film. I know the film was credited to another director. A lot of the cast have gone on record as saying actually Garland was largely responsible for directing this film. And having seen his directorial efforts since then, I could well believe it. But it's got the best written script of any comic book movie I've ever seen. I know people think this is an odd comparison to make, but I make it anyway. I compare it to Spinal Tap, in that Spinal Tap doesn't really have a bad scene in it. In fact, Spinal Tap doesn't really have a scene in it that isn't brilliant. When you watch Spinal Tap, every scene you come to, you go, love this scene, oh, love this scene, love this scene. And the same is true with Dredd. Whenever I put it on, I can't stop watching it because I'll think, well, I'll just watch this bit because I really like this bit. But as soon as it gets onto the next scene, I think, well, I really love this scene, and the one after that, and the one after that. And it's one of those rare, unique movies like Spinal Tap, or with Nell and I even, where you realise that not only is the film a masterpiece, but every scene in the film is a masterpiece. Oh, and just going back briefly to them remaining true to their character, although they do deviate from the look of his uniform, because the uniform from the comics would look slightly ridiculous. Dredd never takes his mask off. He's like the modern man with no name from the Clint Eastwood movies. He's the man with no face, because Dredd never takes his mask off in the comics. I'm not going to be one of those ones that's going to bang on bemoaning the fact that this film flopped. I mean, it is criminal that this film flopped. This film should have been a mega hit, and we should have had a couple of sequels from this now. I'm sure we will, actually. It might just take a bit longer, but if Blade Runner can get a sequel after 35 years, I'm pretty sure Dredd will. If Chong can get a sequel after 30 years, I'm sure Dredd will. It's not unknown for films that didn't do well at the box office to get sequels. It just takes a bit longer for the appeal of the movie to spread and garner enough warranty to make a sequel. And this film, I mean, I don't know anybody who's seen it who didn't think it was a great film. In a funny sort of way, I mean, I'm not going to be one of those ones that actually bemoans the fact that there isn't a sequel. I'm just glad that one film exists. Just because a film is great doesn't automatically mean it should warrant a sequel. There's every chance that a sequel could be a disappointment, even in the hands of a filmmaker like Alex Garland, as talented as Alex Garland. So even if Dredd is one of these little cult movies, these little one-offs like I don't know, Big Trouble in Little China or something that never got a sequel. I'm not going to sit here bemoaning the fact, because at the end of the day, we've still got Dredd. It's still a great movie. It's still a movie I love. It's still the best film I've seen in the past 10 years. And I urge anybody out there who hasn't seen it to go watch it. So there you have it, folks. That's my top 10 list, my top 10 favourite films of the past 10 years. As ever, I'll leave you with one or two that didn't quite make the list, that could have easily got onto the list. If you want to, I haven't said this before, but obviously this goes out, let me know what your top 10 would be. I'd be very interested to hear that and discuss it with you, folks, and discuss what you thought of my choices. So, once again, thanks for joining me, folks. This is me, Big Buddha, signing off, and I shall see everyone out there in YouTube land.
Top 10, this is a top 10. 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 Top 10, this is a top 10.